Hello lovely people, I'm Catherine and welcome to the last February episode, not the last episode but the last episode for February of the Comfort Coverlet. I have done all my fancy stitching. I'm standing up so that I can sort of hold it up to show you, hopefully without it going blurry. And I've also stitched in some of my phrases. So here I've got home is a wood. Here I'm reading it upside down. Home is solitude, home is a beach, friends are home, homing is an instinct, home is a, and I was going to stitch the final word with you. Home is a place inside, home is birdsong. I think that was all I did. Oh no, and there, family is home. So I've just done that every which way, and I chose to use red thread to kind of tie in with the red hearth squares. And so it kind of stands out a bit, yeah, and I'm really pleased with it. There's a couple of things I did want to point out. Here, I talked last time about stitching over stitching. Here I'd done these gold stitches, can you see? And they kept jumping out at me as I was stitching. I kept seeing them a little bit too much. So I just went over and in between with a beige stitch, just to knock them back a bit, to make them blend a bit better. And oh, I've done some French knots here and there. See, sometimes I stitch blue on the tan so it shows up, and other times I just, kept the stitches to their own colours, if you like. And then somewhere else, where was it? Here, where I did those blue linking stitches, I found them a bit strong as well. Excuse me. It's just as you're stitching, if you look at your work, you'll see things leaping out at you that you may be less than happy with. Rather than pulling the stitching out, my go-to is always just to stitch more over the top. So those blue stitches there, can you see I just did a little cross? I just stitched across them with a thread the same colour as the cloth that they're on. And that just, they're still there, they're still the blue linking those two areas that I talked about, but they blend in better. So don't be afraid to overlap your stitching. And if you're someone who worries about your stitching lines not being straight or being wonky, then if you stitch over and over, it just all becomes texture and you don't see that, that your straight lines aren't straight. I personally don't especially love straight lines, but I know we're all different and some of us want everything to be straight, but my answer to everything, I've said it before, is usually more stitching. And I did the little patch of seed stitch with you, and I did more seed stitch here and there as well, just little patches. And here I did some more seed stitching. So that's my piece. So I'm going to just stitch my last word, so I'm going to sit down for that. And I've got you high up for the joining, so I'll need, you'll need to be a distance away for me to fit everything in. Excuse the sound of my chair coming out. So for my text, I did two or three different kinds of text stitching. I used the one that I used last month on the January cloth, the sort of couching technique that I showed you. I think that's in the last episode of January if you didn't see that. And then I did sort of capitals here with where you see home is a beach, just with straight lines. So the C, I just did 3 straight lines. I just like the look of all the different texts. And if you saw Monday's video, the journal for self-care, the journal for all seasons, you'll see there that was all different kinds of text overlaid as well. This was the couching version with the lowercase. This was also, I think, the couching version, and this was just straight line stitching. So there's no right or wrong, it's just, whatever floats your boat. And I like to see all different kinds, I mean, that's very blocky. So I'm just going to stitch this last word here, which is home is a feeling. So I'll zoom you in, and then I'll have to zoom you back out. So hopefully I've got just enough thread, if not I'll have to get some more. So this I'm doing just in a blocky way, so I'm just going to take I'm now doing the F, and I just guess in advance if I can fit all the letters in. Just sort of space them out, sort of pretend draw on the cloth with your needle. As I come up I'll say, so I'll go H-O-M-E-I-S-A, just like that to make sure that you're roughly right. I don't usually write with a pencil or anything and stitch over. I would rather go freehand, but of course you could do that if you prefer. So I'm just going to do the word feeling. And then we can do the exciting thing that I'm sure many of you have been waiting for, of the joining. Now obviously my piece has got certain edges to it, certain kinds of edges, so I can join it in a certain way, but I will talk you through all the eventualities that I can think of as to, you know, how your edges might be and all the different possibilities, and hopefully give you enough information that whatever your two pieces are like, you'll be able to make them fit together. I'm sure you will. I have every confidence in you. I do not have confidence that this thread's going to last till the end of the word though. And I get one more E out of it. I might just squeak out another E. And all the reds came out of my tangle of orts, so they're not all the same red either, you know, they're not all the same thread, they're all different shades. And I don't even really mind if I have to change shade of red halfway a word even. But again, that's just me. Home is a fee. Home is a fee. It's not really what I want to say. I'll show you the back as well when I've finished off here, because the back is a real backstory. And I love that, and I think I've said before, I don't think I'll be putting a backing on mine, but at the end of the year I will show you how I would do it if I was going to. It may change, but I like to see all this, you know, it's the map, the journey that you took to do the stitching on the front. But I will show you if you prefer to put a backing. This hopefully will be enough. Where did I just stick that needle? I've got the washing machine going. I don't know if you can hear it. If it starts spinning, I'll get up and close the door. Because it's a nice day today here. But we had rain yesterday, and apparently the rain's coming back tomorrow. And I don't have a dryer or anything like that, so I did my own laundry this morning, you know, some clothes of mine, and now I'm washing all Stella's towels. And she's had a bath as well today. And I hope that it dries at least a bit, so I can finish it off in the boiler cupboard without making the house all damp. So I could again hide my knot if I wanted to, but I haven't been bothering, to be honest. So fee, I need L-I-N-G. And even if you get near the end, you know, as you just space out your final letters, and if you think you're going to run out of room, then squash them up a bit, and if you think you're going to have too much space left for your liking, then stretch them out a bit. It just all adds to it for me. Is easy, it's just going to be a stick. And the advantage of stitching on this is you don't need to draw yourself reference lines, because you've got reference lines in the piecing. You need to keep yourself in a straight line, or straightish, straight as you need to be. When I do an N or an M or anything like that, or an H, I do the two verticals first, and then the horizontal. Or diagonal in this case. I nearly did an H then. And now I need a G. So I'm just again going to just make it all up of straight lines. And the lettering's quite small, so I don't need to worry about couching the stitches down or anything. And I just go in and out in whatever order I think is logical to make all the lines. And I need a little vertical line there, and then a little, I could leave it like that, it looks like a G, but I'm going to put a little crossbar on it, like so. Home is a feeling. So let's finish that off, and then we can get January in. Right, so I think I'll move my little felt pad to one side for now so I've got the whole surface. Let's put it there. So I wanted mine this way up, with this as my little vaguely roof shape. I've got my big scissors, my big fiskers, my great big snippies that I hardly use, but because I want to keep them sharp, but then it's a bit pointless if you don't use them. But then, you know, for like now, they're going to be very useful. So this, my January piece, I had a load extra left over, because I didn't know where I was going exactly. And I left the edge a good, well, that's about an inch really, unstitched. And that edge is straight enough, I don't need to do any trimming. And I'm quite happy that it's thin enough that I can just make a normal seam with it. So that's that. So if that's you, you know, if you've got a flippy floppy edge of your actual work and plenty of backing cloth left as a border, then that's you. I'll talk you through the way I'm going to do it first, and then I'll talk you through the other ways. Now my February piece, the other thing to check, by the way, is that they are still vaguely the same size. Now if you see here, this is the same size as this, but this is slightly longer than the rest of it. Do you see that? I think you can see that. Do you see there? But I'm just going to join this regardless, and I'll worry about that later, because of the nature of how we're patching and cobbling it all together, if when I've joined that and I turn to add whatever month comes here, and I want this, I could do one of two things. I could either take a seam down here all the way through and lose that end of my log cabin, but you see there I'm going to lose my words if I do that, or I can just stitch another bit here to make that bigger. There's always something you can do, and then it will all blend, and you know, such a mishmash that it won't be an issue. Okay, anyway, so going back to this, but you know, that's just thinking ahead, but you don't have to, because there's always something, like I said. This piece I've stitched right up to the edge, just for the nature of the piecing. So because I've got enough backing here to cover the join on the back, and because I've got a flippy bit here, I'm going to trim this backing and front into a straightish line. Okay? So I'll do that now. When I say straightish, I mean what I say. I'm just going to, if I look along my line, I can see it's not too bad. It goes in and out here and there, but that's what seam allowances are for. If you've got rotary cutters and rulers and all that kind of thing, you go for it. I have, but I'm aware that not everybody does, so that's why I'm just using scissors. So I'm just going to cut. I'm not going to cut the other three sides. I'm going to leave those until we see what's going to be joined to them. There's always a temptation to trim everything up to make it look neat and square, especially if you're a quilter. But it's, with this way of working, it's best to not trim as you go. Trim when you get there, because you never know what you'll need and what you won't. So there, that's slightly, sorry for the noise on the desk, that's left a bit of a gap there, but I'm not going to worry about it. I think that will be taken up by the seam allowance. So now, so this is the side I'm joining to, and this is where I am joining it to, the top of my January piece. So first thing I'm going to do is pin that all out of the way, that backing, just with some of my little applique pins, just so it doesn't get in my way. So I've folded it right back as far as I can, and I'm just going to put 2 or 3 little pins just so it doesn't get trapped anywhere it shouldn't. Right, so now I'm going to take this edge that I want to join to, and I'm going to put it right sides together with my February piece and match the two edges as best I can. Now this sticks out a bit. I could at this point say, well, I might trim that a little bit there. Do you see? I hope I'm in frame. This little bit that sticks out a little slightly. I mean, it's hardly worth bothering, but why not? Let's just trim that. And now I'm cutting through polyester lace with my good fiskars. That's why I winced. Put that in the scraps. So that's going to join to that. So because my backing cloth is very thin and these cloths on the whole are thin, I mean here and there the junctions are a bit bulky, I think I can just sew a seam through everything. Okay, don't worry about the backing for now on this piece. I think I can just sew a seam through everything, and that seam won't be too bulky. If you think your seam might be too bulky, there's another way of doing it which I'll come back to. But for me, I think I could just sew a seam. Let me show you the other way before I pin it. The other way you could do it, if you offer all that up together and think, oh, that's going to be too bulky once I've sewn my seam. Bearing in mind you can then press your seam open. We're not following that traditional patchwork rule of pressing seams to the side. There are no rules. Just press your seam wherever it will lay flatter. So just have a little feel. I can't, I wish I could come round and have a look at all your work, those of you that are a bit unsure, and advise you, but you just have to have a little feel and think, well, can I stitch through those layers comfortably? Even do the needle auditioning thing. Can I stitch comfortably through all those layers? Yes, I can. And then when I have stitched and made a seam, when I press that seam open, is that going to lay nice and flat? Well, mine will, because all my cloths are thin, but yours might be different. So if you do that and you decide, no, that's too thick, what you can do is this instead. So turn your work back up this way, right way up, and then you can turn this under. In this case, where I'm assuming your February one's like mine, all stitched up to the edge. Where you've got your flippy floppy edge that's not attached to the backing, you can then fold that under, lay it over the top of your other piece, and pin all that into place, and then do a little whip stitch all the way along that folded edge. And then you don't have to go right through even, as long as you attach this to this, because later on we're going to do something on the back. And that'll, cover the raw edges on the back. So there's two ways you can do it if you've got a loose edge like that. Okay. If you've got two loose edges, then you just put the two loose edges together. You pin both of the backings away. You put your two loose edges of the top together. You just stitch a normal seam, and then press that seam open. And when I say press, I mean with my fingers. Feel free to use an iron if you want to. Be careful if you've got polyester and stuff in your work. Excuse me. If you go putting a hot iron on it. So the third scenario that I can think of is if you've got two edges like this, stitched right up to the edge. If that's the case, and you've got two edges that you can't join right sides together or do this turning something under and stitching it down, then what you can do then is get a strip of cloth. So on your right side you might even want to piece a strip so that you didn't have a continuous line. So say here I wanted to join this to this and I didn't have, this was all stitched down to the backing. So I could just get a few little scraps of cloth that blended. So I could maybe say I would say get a strip that's about 1.5 inches wide, or even, an 1.5 inches wide. And then I could say I want something orangey here. Have I got something orangey? So I could then get a strip of this. So I could get two strips of that, stitch those together and make a strip long enough to go the whole edge. Join as many pieces as you want to blend with your work on either side. And then once you had your strip, I use this white sheet to show you, but this could be made up of any number of other bits. then you can stitch that down to one of your pieces. So you would then stitch along here like that, and then you flip that over, fold your edge under, and then stitch that down to the other piece. It's exactly the same as we did in the log cabins when we met, you know, when we came to the junctions. So that I call that a joining strip. I think everybody will call that a joining strip. But that's how you can join. And in fact, if you go back, and I'll link it to an early Wonky Wednesday joining the blocks, that's one of the methods when you haven't got seams. Okay, so I hope that is all clear. I, on the other hand, have got this situation where I've got one free edge of the top of my work and one edge all stitched together. So I'm going to stitch and thin work so I can put a seam. So I'm going to do it like that. So I hope that's clear. If you've got other scenarios that I haven't thought of, please feel free to ask me in the comments, or if you're in the Facebook group, put a post there. Now, in terms of the width of my seam here, it's going to be as wide as it needs to be to get all the edges of it in and to not hide anything I don't want hidden. Even if it's not particularly straight, I'm not really bothered. So here I've got this that's slightly narrower, so I want to make sure that I stitch through that. So if I put a pin there, you can see I've got here a very scant 1/4 of an inch in my top. But as I stitch, if I do a straight line there, where that invisible baseline is, then I shall be about 1/2 an inch. That's fine. Don't worry too much about seam allowance as long as you've got enough to hold it. And I think enough to hold it, it depends on the cloth. Enough to hold it might even be as small as 1/8 of an inch, because there's going to be structure in the backing as well. So my seam happens to be mostly 1/2 an inch and a little bit less on one end. Precision is not a requirement. Unless you want it to be. You know, if you want it to be and you can be precise and you've got all the rotary cutty stuff, it's not wrong. It's still slow stitch. That's, you know, this is kind of the engineering part of it, really. But I think the slow stitch aspect of it is that because we've done it all wonky, then we do have to involve ourselves in the process. And I see there I've got a bit of linen that's quite thick. I think it'll be okay. And also, if you really didn't like the idea of doing all this stitching by hand, or you're remotely concerned about the structural integrity, well, don't be, because, you know, there's pieces going back generations that were only hand stitched, but there's nothing wrong with going and running that through your sewing machine if you want to. I don't. I like, when I have a finished piece, to look at it and think I did every stitch by hand. But if that's not something that worries you, and you're happier, certainly when we get up to bigger pieces, to run it through your sewing machine, then I'm not going to accuse you of cheating or anything, because it's not. It's using the tools that you have. So I'm going to put that, back in there. So I'm going to just simply stitch along there. I think I will use a locking back stitch. So I'll do a couple of inches with you, and then I'll go away and finish that on my own, and then come back. I'll get a lazy girl thread, just because that's me, you don't have to. I'm just using, this is machine sewing cotton that I'm using up, but any fine cotton thread, even if you've only got embroidery floss, you can use one strand of embroidery floss. It's not maybe as strong as this, but I think by the time you've got all your fancy stitching and the backing cloth all joined as well, it's not going to be a problem. Use what you got. Just make sure that I'm somewhere where I can zoom you in. So I'm not going to stitch this to this. I'm only stitching, this is pinned out of the way, this is the backing for January, this is the backing for February. So I'm going to start with the back stitch, and then I'm just going to do a running stitch through everything, and then I'm going to go back as if I'm doing invisible baste, a tiny bite back, and then forward again. Get the pin out. And then another normal running stitch, making sure I go right through. If you have to stab stitch, if you've got little patches of thick cloth here and there, then you can stab stitch. And then a little way back and forward again. So it's a running stitch and then back and forward. Running stitch. If you want to do the back every stitch, if that's a handier rhythm for you, then you go for it, but I generally alternate them, and I think that's enough. And I'm just eyeballing the edge of the work and making sure I go in a vaguely straight line, but again, I'm not worrying about it. If you want to draw a line, if that makes you happy, then you feel free. Okay, so I'll stitch my way all the way along to the end and then I'll be back for the next bit. Okay, so I've stitched my seam all along there, and so I'll just show you how it looks on the right side so far. So on the right side, it's, you know, it's a nice neat edge. Everything's trapped where it should be. It's all fine and dandy-o, but this seam is now all pressed to one side and it is a little bit bulky, so I do want that seam pressed open. So what I'm going to do is, and it's especially bulky here because it's got the backing and all the log cabiny bits. Now I think possibly an iron would take care of it, but I can't be bothered to go and get my iron out, so I'm going to just do a little tacking stitch to hold the seam down. I'd rather stitch than iron. Could put some pins in first, I guess. Yours again will depend, you know, if yours is how yours wants to lay. I just like this process of doing what's necessary. So I'm just going to put a few pins just to hold it in place, and I've got a neutral coloured thread. Even like here, don't be afraid, don't be scared. Like here, there's all these junctions joining. Obviously you don't want to trim that right down back, but there's no harm in just getting your scissors and just snipping away little bits of excess if you think they're redundant. I've still left some, you know, I haven't trimmed right down to the stitching obviously. But I just really want all that to lay open, ready for when I join the backing. So I'll go away and do that, and then I'll be back once I've stitched that down. I will try, I'm going to, like I said, I've got a neutral thread. I'll try not to go right through, but if I do, I'm not going to worry about it. There's so much going on, it's not going to show. But I should be able to just stitch it through into this backing, if that makes sense. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll be back with you. I've come back just to show you how I'm holding the work. As it gets bigger, as you know, as the months go on, and if you're not used to stitching on big cloths, the advantage of this modular thing is most of the stitching is done on small sections, but of course when we're joining and so on, we will have to do some stitching on bigger sections. I just kind of, it's worth, if you can't already, teaching yourself to stitch in every direction. So, you know, practice while you've got a small cloth. So normally if you're right-handed, you'd hold your work this way and you'd gather that up in your hand and you'd stitch like that. It's handier here for me to turn it because otherwise I've got all that pinned seam all scrunched up in my hand, and stitched that way. So there I can hold it here where it's just this, my fine January cloth. And when I said tacking, I literally mean just taking big stitches. I'm not doing invisible baste or anything, it's all going to be hidden in the seam, so it doesn't have to be invisible. I've got my finger behind just to see if I'm coming right through or not, though like I said, I'm not really worrying about it. I'm going to actually trim a bit more of that linen away out of there, just because it is a bit thick. I might trim some of that as well. So now I can stitch north to south if you like. So just feeling behind with my finger if I'm coming right through, but like I said, if I come through a bit, then nothing bad will happen. It won't show. So I'm pushing that seam flat with my thumb. I've got all my fingers underneath and I'm stitching away from me. Not pulling it too tight. I'm not bothered really about tacking that all down. It'll all get smushed. Just so long as I've mostly got that seam out of the way. If it falls in the path of my needle, then I'll stitch it down, and if it doesn't, then it'll be fine. So I'll just do this all the way along to the end, and then I'll be back when I've done that. Okay, I'm coming back up to the end now, so you'll see at one point it got more comfortable to hold it from this side. So we're back to listen to the cloth if you followed last year's Slow Stitch project. Rather than having a prescribed set of rules of how things should be done, we're paying attention to the work, and with, you know, a set of tools in our toolbox of how we can deal with different scenarios, we're then paying attention to the work, seeing what it needs and doing that, rather than saying, right, it must be done this way, whatever. I hope I've explained that well enough for you to understand what I mean. So now I'm coming up to the end. I'm just going to take one more stitch, just a little back stitch just to hold it in place, and snip. So just putting a knot ready for in a minute. So now I've got that seam, this side's laying flat anyway because it's the single layer. If you had the backing on both sides, then you might want to stitch that down as well. But again, it's like I said, it's paying attention to what the cloth wants. So now I'm going to turn it this way, and I'm going to see if there's room in that gap there. I'll get the pins out of my backing now. I think I will be trimming this backing because there's quite a lot left. Now, is there room there for that seam to lay down flat in that gutter? Do you see? I've pulled this back as far as I can, as far as the stitching will allow. In my case, it's only basting stitches, so I could cut them, but you might have done fancy stitching up to, you know, 1 inch or ½ an inch from the edge, so I'm going to pretend I can't get those out. What I can do now, if that won't fit flat into that gutter that's laying, is just then take my big scissors or my small scissors, whichever I'm happier with, and then just carefully, being careful to only cut the top layer. Again, I'm cutting that polyester lace with my big fiskars. You can trim that seam back. You can go back to, certainly 1/4 of an inch, but you can just trim a little slither off. If at any point you cut something you shouldn't, don't panic. That's what applique's for. You know, if I was to cut through to the other side, I just see it as a design opportunity. I said that before. That's what applique's for. So now it will all lay in that gap, nice and flat. Do you see? Do you see? So then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decide how much of this I need. Now I want the backing to come over that seam. It's going to form a little cover for that seam. Again, making sure everything lays as flat as it can do. And I just want enough to turn under, and I'm going to do a whip stitch. So you can see that I don't need all that. I could leave all that if I wanted to. I could just, you know, if I had really thin as I have, I could just do that. But I just think, you know, why have the bulk if you don't need all that bulk? So I need enough to cover the seam. So that is about that much there where my finger is, but I need enough to turn under, so I need to come out, I'm going to come out another ½ inch. So if I cut it there, and I always like to audition, so I've cut it that wide, let's say. Have I still got enough now to turn an edge under? and stitch that down and have that seam covered. Yes, I have. So I'm safe cutting it there. And you can cut it. You can also, if it's easy to tear and you're already on the straight of grain, tear it, even though it's attached. Sorry for the noise. I'm going to tear it because it was on the straight of grain and I know it tears easily. I'm just supporting the other side so I'm not pulling at, the seam I just stitched or anything. Don't do this unless you're 100% certain that you were on the straight of grain, otherwise it might tear cattywampus and you'll end up with not enough. If you do it and that happens, then you just go back and do the joining strip thing. Let's get the strings off that want to come off. There's usually a couple. So now I just want to turn that edge under. Again, if you wanted to go and iron it, that would probably be sensible. And I'm only going to attach it, sorry if my head's coming in the way, I'm only going to attach it to the stitch part of February. I'm not going to stitch it to this backing. I might well come back and do that later, but when I join here I might want to trim this as well and then I cut my stitching. So I'm just going to leave that edge unstitched and just join it to where February's is stitched. Just make sure that seam is, laying nice and flat. And I just turn it over and put a pin in it. Again, like I said, you could go and iron your seam in so it stays where you want, if that made you happier. And I feel with my fingers if something's sticking up there, I'll just tuck that in and turn it under. And again, that goes back to when we talked about sensory stitching. It's not only with textiles how they look, is it? It's also important how they feel. It's maybe even more important how they feel in some ways, especially if we're going to wrap ourselves in it when we're done. So again, I'm just going to make sure that everything's where it should be. Tuck that edge under. Does it feel nice and flat? It feels flat enough. And if you're not used to pinning on a flat, that's why I took the felt away, because pinning is better on a hard surface. I don't mind if I scratch my desk, it's a work table. If you do mind, then you need to put something down to protect your surface. But it's, rather than having to get your hand under, sorry, my head's going to come in just to make sure I'm covering, yeah. So I go into the top with the pin, I feel the pin bite through the cloth, and then with this finger I just push the cloth up to make a little ridge. And still I'm using my teeny tiny applique pins because I nearly never use anything else. I'll just do it one more time. So you bite through till you feel your surface, and then you make a ridge in the cloth by pushing. So you could do that on, a great big piece. You can still do that. You don't need to be able to get your hand underneath. Let's just put one more pin there. And then you could, I'm going to do a little whip stitch with my same piece in cotton. You could, if you didn't like doing whip stitch or whatever, you could just do a line of stitching there. I wouldn't personally do that on the sewing machine because that will then show on the other side. But that of course is up to you. Sorry, the washing machine started spinning and now the door's come open. I'll just go and shut it. Right, so whip stitch. So I'm going to gather my cloth from this side because that's the smallest side. This is what I said about, working with a larger cloth. Just gather it however is the most comfortable for you. I'm not going to stitch the two areas that are just backing cloth away. I'm just going to start together. Sorry, I'm not going to stitch them together. I'm just going to start here where I see my fancy stitching starting. I'll just do an extra little back stitch just to anchor it. And then I come along a bit, and again I'm making sure I'm just in the backing and not through to the front, and then just come forward maybe 1/4 of an inch up into the fold and take a stitch. Oops, again I'm sorry it's white on white. Maybe I should have done it with a contrasting thread, but I think you all know how to do whip stitch, certainly if you've been here a while. So I'm into just the backing of this piece, the February piece, go forward maybe 1/4 of an inch, and then come up, just taking a little bite of the fold and pull through. And if you do that in a matching thread, I mean, you'll see there's a line there, of course, but you hardly see it. And if you want to make a feature of it, use a contrasting thread. Maybe I will do that on a future piece. I think it's nice to see the construction as well sometimes. Like I spoke about in January, sometimes when I'm doing the paperless piecing, I use a contrasting thread so that you see the stitching. So just, you know, just practice now. You've got a reasonably small piece if you're new to working on large cloths. Just start to get a feel for how you can handle that, you know, by stitching in different directions or by how you can bunch the cloth up in your hand. And I hope you don't find it scary and intimidating. There's no need for it to be. It's just finding your way, you know, depending on how your body works and what you like to do. So I'll just whip stitch this all the way along, and then I'll be back when I've done that. Okay, so that's my whip stitching done. My two pieces are joined. The other thing I did want to say is if on the back, if you've got that scenario that I talked about earlier, where both of your edges have had to be trimmed because you haven't got that loose flippy floppy edge, and you've done the joining strip that I talked about on the front, what you then need to do on the back is get a strip of cloth about 1.5 inches or so wide, and then with an iron would make more sense. Just press in 1/2 inch each side like that, and then just put that over the gap and whip stitch it down both sides just to cover that gap. You could also, if you preferred, lay at one side of the gap and do a running stitch through, going not all the way through, the same as I showed you for the front, and then turning it over and folding and whip stitching. Just depends if you don't like doing whip stitch and you want to minimise it. I would press in the two edges and make a strip, you know, that wasn't raw edge, and then lay it over the gap and whip stitch up and down both sides, because I quite enjoy whip stitching. So I hope I've covered every scenario. Do feel free to ask me if you've got, because there's always someone. There's always one, isn't there? No, no, seriously, I do. I really don't mind you asking me questions. I don't mind you posting in the Facebook group. You know, photographs are always helpful if you've got a particular issue. But let me just show you the front. And I hope that you find it exciting to have joined your first two pieces together. It lays flat enough, you know, it's cloth. And I do, like I said last week, want to do something here, and I definitely need to do more, finish my fancy stitching on my January, so I've got this week to do that. But isn't it lovely to have the two pieces joined? And after only 2 months, or only 1/6 of the way through the year, we've got quite a sizable piece, really. And if you want to stop there, if you say, you know, this isn't doing it for me anymore, then you can. You've got something, you know. I could turn that into a pillow or a wall hanging or something. I'm now seeing as well, I saw I had this little roof that went with that. There's also a kind of roof going on here, so my whole self is under a roof. So yeah, do have a look at your work. I say it often, step back and look at your work every so often and see if it's telling you things that you weren't aware were there. So I hope you enjoyed that. This video I will be referring you back to throughout the year, because I'm not going to spend time every month, at the end of every month, going through the joining process. I will show you if things come up, you know, or it'll be maybe an opportunity if one of you says, oh, this has happened to me, this scenario or that scenario, or if I run across things slightly different. But otherwise, remember this video. I'll probably link it in every future video so that you can look back and see the joining. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you're excited to carry on now that you've got January and February stitched together. Next week will be the 1st of March, the first week of March. I have some ideas which I will share with you then and not before. But meanwhile, thank you so much for watching. I can't fit it all in, can I? And I look forward to you joining me next time for more cloth tales. Bye bye.